Hey everybody, it's your human anatomy and physiology teacher, Mr. Poser. Today we're continuing our discussion of the nervous system by discussing the most important part of the nervous system, and that's the central nervous system. As we know already, we've practiced a lot of times, your central nervous system consists of your brain and your spinal cord. And while we're not really going to talk about the spinal cord today, we are going to talk about the brain a lot. So your brain, hopefully by watching this video, is going to form new neural connections and form new neural pathways, and your brain will learn about itself. All right, so let's get into it. We're going to discuss the structures and functions in the brain. So, just a couple words here before we get started. The brain is the most complicated structure ever studied. It is the most complicated piece of matter that has ever existed, as far as we know. It's made up of 86 billion neurons, and if you remember from our discussion of the nervous system earlier in this unit, each neuron can have up to maybe like thousands of different connections to other neurons. So that's 86 billion, like to the 1,000th, which is just an insane number of possible neural pathways that can be established. So it is estimated that the brain can know about 100 trillion different things and be able to make 100 trillion different connections between neurons. And that's how many different neural pathways you can have. So every time you learn something new, you build a new neural pathway, hopefully like you are right now. And every time that you reinforce something or you do something again, you're thickening the myelin sheath on that neural pathway, thereby making it easier for you to remember or easier for you to do. And that's what practice is for. Okay, so the brain is absolutely amazing. So we're going to start on the outside and work our way in. So what's outside of the brain? It rests in the cranial cavity, which is, the cavity that holds your brain. It's in your skull, right? It's your cranial cavity. It's covered by meninges, and meninges are membranes between the bone and the soft tissues of the nervous system. So obviously you have your skull, but then in between your brain and your skull are three different layers. One's called the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And those are three different meninges. So if you have meningitis, you have an inflammation, you have an infection of the meninges, which is a really, really big deal. You can die of meningitis. All right, so here's the meninges. You have three of them. The dura mater is the outermost. Dura meaning it's durable. It's kind of tough. The arachnoid mater is it's a web-like membrane between the dura and the pia. They're often just called dura and pia. And it contains what we call cerebrospinal fluid, and we're going to talk about what that does in just a minute, CSF. And then the innermost meninge is called the pia mater, which is the thinnest. And, well, as I said, the innermost, and it contains blood vessels, right? So there is established by cerebrospinal fluid and the meninges. It's called the blood-brain barrier. So the central cerebrospinal fluid, which is unique to the central nervous system, maintains an ion concentration needed for action potentials to be firing from one place to the next, because it's all about ions and concentrations when we're discussing the action potential. It maintains ion concentration and provides a pathway to blood. And of course, the brain needs a lot of blood. It needs a lot of ATP. Neurons need a lot of ATP, and there's a lot of neurons there. So cerebrospinal fluid is formed and stored in ventricles, and we're actually moving on to the inside a little bit, skipping ahead. Well, we're not going all the way from the outside in, but you know what I mean. So yeah, and in the arachnoid mater, that is storing cerebrospinal fluid, and that forms what we call the blood-brain barrier. What kind of stuff in the blood is able to access the brain, and so on and so forth. So that's what the blood-brain barrier is talking about, the BBB. All right, so let's talk about brain development a little bit. As time has gone on, and nervous systems of animals have gotten more and more and more and more complicated, what happened on our way to developing our brain, the evolution of our brain, human brain, is that one part of the brain that develops when, as a fetus, it grows a lot bigger. It has a lot more to it than the other parts of the brain. So in fetal development, really, there's three main segments that grow into a normal human brain here, and those are the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. So check out this fetus at 5 weeks. You're starting to develop a nervous system here. Here's the forebrain, here's the midbrain, here's the hindbrain, and there's the spinal cord. So if we divide up the structures of the brain into these three different categories, well, we can figure out like, oh, this cerebrum and a set of structures called the diencephalon develop from the forebrain. The midbrain, well, which develops from the midbrain. That's its own thing. And then the hindbrain develops into the brainstem and the cerebellum. And these are all parts of the brain that we're going to be discussing here in a little bit. So as time progresses here, we can see these new structures and see these new, see the new, well, yeah, I don't know. I was trying to think of another word for it, but see these new structures grow and how they grow as the person develops, right? So there you have it. We're going to be talking about the forebrain and the midbrain and the hindbrain quite a bit here. What really separates us out, I mean, as in humans, what separates us out is our brains, right? But what particular part of our brain? It's our cerebrum, which develops from the forebrain, and that's the largest part, and it's divided into two hemispheres. All of our crazy, human experiences, our superior decision making, our emotional processes, our memories, all that stuff really happens in the cerebrum. Other animals don't have that. Okay, if you look at like a lizard brain or like a bird brain, their cerebra are not anywhere near as big as ours relative to the size of their body. So like, right, like a whale has a way bigger brain than us, but is a whale smarter? Not necessarily. More intelligent? No. Partly because of the size relative to the other parts of the brain and how many neural connections and how many neurons are able to be functioning. All right, so what separates us out is our cerebrum, for sure. Separates us out from what you would consider the reptile brain. But yeah, so the cerebral cortex, that's the outermost part of the cerebrum, and it has these, well, those little grooves and folds in the brain that you see. It's all wrinkly because of structures called gyri, singular gyrus, and sulci, singular sulcus. So all those different folds in the brain, what do folds do for living things? Well, they increase surface area. And this increased surface area in the cerebral cortex allows for even more connections between neurons to form and more things to know and things to do and more complex neural pathways. So again, if you look at, say, like a less intelligent animal's brain, like a rabbit brain or something like that, it's very smooth. Their cerebrum is very smooth. They don't have a whole lot of gyri and sulci like we do. Thus, they're not as intelligent. Okay? But although animal intelligence is still being heavily studied and heavily debated over what qualifies as being intelligent. But yeah, our cerebra really set us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. So let's take a look at the different structures within a cerebra. So this is color coded based on 4 different main lobes that we can find in the cerebral cortex. And I highlighted 2 other sulci here that we're going to talk about in a second. All right, so let's do our lobes first, and you're going to be familiar with all of these because the muscles that help hold your head together and the bones that make up the skull, the cranial part of the skull, they have the same names, right? So check it out. This is our frontal lobe, and I'm going to describe what happens in the frontal lobe here in just a little bit. I have it on the next slide. So yellow is our parietal lobe. There it is. Parietal lobe. Back of the head is the occipital lobe. All words we should have heard before. And of course, on the side is the temporal lobe. All right. So 2 other structures that I would like you to label on here. This squiggly line in between the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe, that's normally where the coronal suture would be if we're talking about the skull, but that's not, since we're not talking about the skull, this is what we call the central sulcus. Okay, so remember I was just telling you about the folds and the grooves in the brain are called gyri and sulci, and this one that splits right down the middle, right up here, that is called the central sulcus, and it separates out the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And over here, separating out the temporal lobe from, well, the parietal and the frontal, this is the lateral sulcus. Okay? So there are a few more structures that I'm going to talk about that aren't necessarily on this diagram, but yeah, this is what I'm going to ask you to be able to identify, and maybe I might switch it up with like, oh, tell me the function of each of these lobes. Yeah, I put the cerebellum on here, but we're going to talk about that in a second. So yeah, what the frontal lobe does, it's responsible for higher intellectual processes. It controls emotions and it helps with executive functions and motor functions. Okay, so a region called the primary motor cortex, and lots of different areas for interpreting. Well, not that's in the parietal lobe actually. Let me go back a second. But yeah, motor functions happen in the frontal lobe, and higher intellectual executive processes and emotional processes happen in your frontal lobe. Okay, interpreting sensory information is done in the parietal lobe. Okay, so there's a region in the parietal lobe. It's called the primary somatosensory cortex, and it's responsible for being able to sense things with different parts of your body. You'll know that something is touching your arm, and it'll activate a certain part of the parietal lobe. You know something is touching your feet. Same thing. The occipital lobe, the visual cortex is located in the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe's main job is thus to analyze visual information, which is a really, really big job since we use our eyes more than pretty much any other sense, or I should say our vision more than any other sense. So the occipital lobe has a very big job, and it's processing a lot of information every millisecond of every day. Okay, then the temporal lobe, its job is to interpret complex patterns and analyze auditory information. So hearing is interpreted, sounds are interpreted in your temporal lobe. And you're able to interpret complex patterns. We excel at that in comparison to a lot of other animals too. Other animals are able to, solve puzzles and do that kind of thing with their frontal and temporal lobes, but we're just a little bit better at it, I would say. But yeah, we're going to talk about the cerebellum. The cerebellum's not part of the cerebrum, so we're going to talk about that later on. Okay, a couple of the things that I wanted to talk about that are not necessarily on the diagram. So we talked about the central sulcus. It's between the frontal and parietal lobes, separates the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. So the precentral gyrus is also known as what we call the motor cortex, or the primary motor cortex, and it's responsible for the actions of muscles. So you can stimulate one part of the cerebrum, and it'll cause your arm to move, or another part will cause your leg to move. Yeah, so these parts of the brain are activated based on what's moving, or what muscles it tells to move, if that makes sense. And then the postcentral gyrus, post is in like behind, is made of the sensory cortex, and that's responsible for interpreting touch. Okay, so like I was saying before, you feel pressure on your arm or something like that. It's going to be felt by the sensory cortex. It's going to be interpreted by the sensory cortex. All right, so the brain is absolutely amazing. Hope we're picking up on that by now. If we're also talking about what the cerebrum is made up of, there's white matter and gray matter. And white matter, you may have heard of both of these before. White matter, it's regions of the CNS containing the myelinated axons. So as we know, myelin is a lipid, or at least we should know, myelin is a lipid. So there's a lot of fatty substance in the brain that's myelin. That's what the white matter is largely. And the gray matter are the regions in the central nervous system, particularly in the cerebral cortex, containing the cell bodies and unmyelinated fibers of those neurons. Okay, so if we go back to our diagram of a neuron, we can figure out which part of a single neuron is going to be part of the white matter, which one's going to be part of the gray matter. Okay? Let's keep going here. So inside the brain, deep to the cerebrum, we're going to find the diencephalon, which I referred to before. It also develops from the forebrain, but it develops from the posterior forebrain rather than the anterior forebrain. And it's located between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. So you've got two hemispheres that are divided up by something called the corpus callosum, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But yeah, it's located between the hemispheres, and it's superior to the brainstem, which leads to the spinal cord. The diencephalon contains three main structures that I'm going to ask you to know. One is the thalamus, which serves as the quote-unquote gateway for sensory impulses and it directs them to the appropriate part of the cortex. All right, so think about this. You feel a spider crawling on your leg, and sensory neurons in your leg are going to send a signal up to your central nervous system to decide what to do about this feeling that you have on your leg. So that sensory information is first sent to the thalamus, and the thalamus's job is to send those signals in the right direction. It's like It's like a router almost. Its job is to send that signal to the right part of the brain, so the right part of the brain can interpret it and send a message back to get the spider off your leg or something like that. Okay, and then the hypothalamus, hypo meaning below, hypothalamus regulates homeostatic factors, like say its job is to, it's doing those negative feedback loops. Its job is to regulate temperature, blood pressure, water balance, hunger, all that stuff. And a lot of the primary functions of being alive, they are maintained by the hypothalamus, right? So over here, it's not necessarily it's not necessarily survival functions that you can do with your cerebrum, but the deeper we get down into the brain, the more into the survival mode we get. So like a lot of animals, we're gonna share like a brain stem. We're gonna share similarities in the hypothalamus, in the pons, medulla, all that kind of stuff. Cerebellum too. Okay, but yeah, thalamus and hypothalamus are both part of what we call the diencephalon. And third, the diencephalon contains what we call the limbic system. And the limbic system is controlling emotions and expression, and it helps to guide behavior, right? So your frontal lobe, I should say, is, as I said before, is also responsible for emotions, but it's more responsible for emotional processing. What are you going to do about yourself feeling sad? Okay, your limbic system is like, I'm sad, but your frontal lobe is going to be like, why do I feel sad? I feel sad because this. So your limbic system is more processing these like primal emotions, like I'm angry, I'm sad, but your frontal lobe will be deciding what to do with that. Yeah, so the limbic system, I'm not going to ask you to remember all of these, but they're made up of structures called the amygdala, the hippocampus, which stores a lot of long-term memories, and your pituitary glands. Pituitary glands are, they're releasing hormones that help you grow up. All right, so there's our limbic system. Let's get to the very bottom of this. See what I did there? The brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord, and that is the most base level part of the brain. Like all animals that have a complex nervous system are going to have a brainstem with these kinds of structures. Maybe not these exact structures, but again, we're getting to the bottom of like what it requires to stay alive, right? So the midbrain joins the spinal cord with the, that should say higher parts of the brain. There we go. Higher parts of the brain. These are all three components of the brainstem. So the midbrain, it develops from the midbrain, right? The pons relays impulses between the medulla and the cerebellum. And the cerebellum, as I put before, sorry, I'm a little disorganized here, but the cerebellum's job is to control the position of body parts and maintain structure and posture and balance, right? So if you have a cerebellar or misfunction, you're not going to be able to stand up properly. You can't maintain posture. You're not going to be able to balance. So the cerebellum really works in coordination with the other parts of your brain in order for your fine motor functions, being able to do cool stuff like this. Yeah, yeah. But that's what your cerebellum does. So your cerebellum needs to be in contact with your the rest of your brain, and that happens through the actions of the pons. Okay, and then the medulla oblongata. You may have heard of this before from, is it Waterboy? I think it might be Waterboy. Yeah, Adam Sandler movie. It controls blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, and rhythm. Things you got to do to stay alive, right? So this is common among lots of different animals that you're going to find. Everybody needs blood pressure, everybody needs heart rate, everybody needs breathing rhythm, but maybe you don't have the same executive processing if you're a Komodo dragon or something like that. Okay, so let's end off this video with our diagram of the brain. Hooray! Let's label this stuff, and I gotta move my face a couple times here in order for this to happen. All right, so this doesn't have. We already had the diagram of the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex, so we're not labeling the lobes here, but we are going to. Hold on. We are going to label the cerebrum. Cerebrum. There it is. All right, the outermost part here. So the structure, this white structure in the middle, it connects the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. This is called the corpus callosum, and there's some very interesting stuff that you can do with a severed corpus callosum. We're going to watch a video on that. It's going to be very interesting. Right over here, this green area, that would be inferior to the corpus callosum. These are the ventricles that we discussed at the beginning of the video, containing cerebrospinal fluid. Following that, okay, that's cerebrum behind my face, everybody. Following that, this structure over here, it's kind of highlighted because, or it's like dotted because it's like deep to the ventricles. That is the thalamus. Okay, so there's our thalamus, and right below the thalamus, this arrow right here is pointing to the hypothalamus. Okay, there's our hypothalamus. And our another component of the diencephalon, actually, and part of the limbic system, is right here. These two little thingies make up the pituitary gland, which is a lot of different things. But yeah, if we get to the endocrine system, we'll talk more about the pituitary gland. So there's the thalamus, and then these three segments right here, these are making up the brainstem. So this middle part, this yellow one is called the midbrain. It's right in the middle, right? Makes sense. Midbrain. The pons. There's the pons connecting the cerebellum to the rest of the brain, which, by the way, this blue thing is the cerebellum. And then finally, at the very bottom, before you reach the spinal cord, this is the medulla oblongata. All right. So that is it for this video. Please let me know if you have any questions. The brain's amazing. We're going to be spending some time on this, and I look forward to it. Just let me know if you have questions. Bye.